So when you think of Murakami Haruki, what image first pops into your head?
Well, for many, I think it's probably, the quiet jazz bars, maybe a cat.
Right, or a character just sort of lost in a big city somewhere. That existential solitude thing.
Exactly, that urban coolness. He's this huge global phenomenon, isn't he?
Totally. And his work often feels like this deep dive into purely personal melancholy, maybe surreal escapism.
Hmm.
Like it exists somewhere separate from actual history.
That's definitely been the common view for decades now. Readers connect with those internal journeys, the unique vibe, the feeling that his stories happen in a kind of timeless, almost apolitical space.
Okay, well, hold on to that thought because we might need to reframe things quite radically today.
Ooh.
Yeah, because today, July 4th, 2025, is the release date for Professor Kim Kyo's new book. It's called Murakami Haruki, Where Are You Now?
Ah, yes, I've been hearing about this one.
And her insights, well, they could completely shift how we understand Haruki's entire body of work.
Sure.
Seriously.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So that's our focus for this deep dive then.
Absolutely. We're going to unpack Professor Kim's really powerful argument. Basically, she says Haruki's novels are much more than just those introspective reflections we mentioned.
Right. She sees them as something else entirely.
Yes, as a kind of profound literary practice. She calls it memory restoration and healing. And she argues it directly confronts these unaddressed historical traumas of modern Japan.
Wow, okay. That is a different take. Memory restoration.
Exactly. So our mission really is to get our heads around how, through his very unique style, Haruki acts as what she terms a solitary figure, someone who's bravely challenging this deep collective amnesia in Japanese society.
A solitary figure pushing against forgetting. That's fascinating. It really does offer a completely fresh way to look at an author so many of us feel we know so well.
It really does. Because as you said, one common criticism, or maybe just an observation about Haruki's work has been this apparent lack of direct historical narrative.
Hmm. He doesn't really write straightforward historical fiction, does he? Not in the conventional sense.
No, you won't find him dropping explicit historical commentary right into the plot like some other contemporary Japanese writers might. But Kim Kyo, she just flat out challenges this view.
How so?
She asserts that Haruki is, in fact, intensely focused on recording the shame. That's her phrase. Recording the moral stain, the responsibility inherited from his father's generation.
His father's generation, and the actions of the Japanese state during, difficult periods.
Exactly. And what's really insightful is how she interprets this. It's not like he's writing a history textbook.
No, it sounds like she sees it more psychologically.
Precisely. She sees it as Haruki's almost subconscious, instinctual resistance to the guilt and violence that got imprinted on him unconsciously from that paternal generation. It's like this deep internal wrestling match with the past playing out in his fiction.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It leads us to another really interesting concept she brings up, doesn't it? This idea of collective mourning.
Yes. Songyung, she calls it in Korean. She argues that all that melancholy we feel in his books, the loneliness, the sense of loss, it's not just about the individual characters feeling down.
Right. It's bigger than that. It reflects the kind of societal condition.
Exactly, a societal and collective state of grief. It suggests that there's this unresolved sorrow, unacknowledged wounds just lingering in the world he creates, and maybe our world too.
So underneath all the cool, sophisticated stuff, the sex, the wine, the jazz, there's this shadow, a shadow of forgotten or maybe deliberately ignored history, a deep societal ache.
Perfectly put. And this really brings us to the core of Kim Won-kyo's argument, I think. She sees Haruki's entire literary project as driven by this need for memory restoration.
Okay, memory restoration. So it's not just about remembering facts like dates and names.
No, it's much deeper. It's about confronting how the collective guilt, the wounds from Japan's war and colonial past, how they continue to affect the present, how they ripple outwards.
Which raises the big question, how does he do that if he's not writing direct historical accounts?
Well, Kim Eun-kyo explains that Haruki consciously reenacts these complex, often contradictory aspects of his father's generation within the novel.
Reenacts them, like showing different sides.
Yeah, showing them as both perpetrators and victims of history sometimes, that complex intersection.
Okay, can you give an example?
Sure, she talks a lot about the wind-up bird chronicle. Remember the character Kato?
Vaguely, yes. Representing the old Japanese army.
Right. Kim Eun-kyo highlights how that memory, that trauma, is reenacted through the protagonist Okada, especially his experiences down on the way, the violence, the death. the darkness.
That well is such a powerful symbol, isn't it? Like the deep unconscious.
Exactly. And it's not just the events themselves, but Okada's repeated imagining of these experiences. Kim Unkyo sees this as Haruki's way of performing memory restoration for war trauma that Japanese society has largely tried to avoid looking at.
So it's a psychological excavation happening within the story.
You got it. And another powerful example she uses from Kafka on the Shore.
Ah, the boy killing his father. The Oedipal theme, but different.
Right. She links that, a variation on the Orpheus myth, too. Apparently, she links it to this fundamental resistance against, as she puts it, a world that tries not to remember.
Facing the uncomfortable truths that society wants to bury.
Exactly. And this connects to that deeper existential idea, the solitary figure she mentioned earlier, the Dandoksha.
Right. His protagonists often choose that path, don't they? Dealing with their own personal wounds, but also somehow connecting with these huge world traumas, war, violence, lies.
Yes, and crucially, Kim Yunkyo argues this isolation isn't escapism. It's not just running away.
No, it sounds like she sees it as an active stance.
Absolutely. A deliberate act of questioning history, questioning their own place in it. Their solitude is this fierce internal interrogation of the social structures, the psychological habits that allow forgetting to take hold.
Okay, that's a really powerful way to think about his characters. Now, you mentioned another key concept, something called the Haruki simulacre.
Yes. Now, this might sound a little bit theoretical at first, but stick with us, because it's apparently key to understanding Haruki's method. Have you come across the term simulacre before?
I have, yeah. It's associated with the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, isn't it?
That's the one. And put simply, a simulacre is like an original Einkelis image, a copy or a reproduction that feels maybe even more real than the original thing it's supposed to represent.
Right, like maybe a perfect Disney World version of Main Street feeling more Main Street than any actual Main Street, or
Yeah.
a hyper-realistic simulation.
Exactly, that kind of thing.
Mm.
So how does Haruki use this? Well, Kim Yoon-kyo defines the Haruki simulacre specifically as a literary adventure to approach truth even within illusions and endless simulations of reality.
Okay. So his worlds often feel real, but they're also dreamlike, unreal.
Precisely. They seem to mimic reality perfectly on the surface, but then he twists it, introduces things that just, well, they don't exist in our world, little glitches in the matrix.
And Kim Yukio connects this technique directly back to the historical trauma idea.
She does. It's revelatory. She argues that his way of blurring the lines, reality and fantasy, memory and forgetting it, perfectly matches his strategy of indirect and continuous questioning.
Questioning those war traces, the historical traumas that society has ignored or maybe even deleted from the official narrative.
Exactly. So he's using the surreal, the fantastical, almost like a surgeon's tool to get at these incredibly real but deeply avoided truths.
That's brilliant. Can you give examples of this simulacre in action?
Yeah, she points to things like in Norwegian Wood, remember how the voices of the dead come back
Yeah.
so vividly, almost physically present.
Mm-hmm. It's chilling. More than just a ghost story.
Right. She sees it as a confrontation via simulacre. Or think about 1Q84, where the story itself plays with the boundary between the novel's world and quote-unquote reality.
And Hard-Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World is maybe the ultimate example, with its two parallel worlds.
Definitely. And Kim Moon-kyo really stresses these settings, these fantastical elements. They aren't just flights of fancy. They're not escapism.
She calls them codes of restoration.
Yes. Codes of restoration working against the politics of memory, against historical distortion. It's like this incredibly bold literary experiment where he's rewriting erased truths, but within these dreamlike landscapes.
Like embedding hidden messages in the surreal.
Exactly. A secret language to unlock forgotten history.
Okay, this completely changes how you might think about the whole Harukist phenomenon, doesn't it? His massive global popularity.
It really does. Kim In-kyo pushes us to look beyond just a superficial idea of healing when it comes to his work.
Right, because healing can be such a buzzword, often quite shallow.
Totally. She makes a sharp distinction between Haruki's kind of healing and the healing marketing you see everywhere. For her, true healing in Haruki's world starts with something much harder,
Which is?
directly confronting deep pain and collateral suffering. It means looking squarely at lost history, at unresolved trauma. No easy answers, no quick fixes.
That feels much more aligned with the mood of his books, actually. So how does she explain his incredible popularity, then, if it's not just easy comfort reading?
Well, this is really compelling. She reinterprets the appeal of the Harukists, his devoted readers worldwide. She argues it goes beyond just personal taste.
Okay.
She suggests it actually reveals this latent collective desire for what she calls the aesthetics of loss and joint memory restoration.
Joint memory restoration, like people are unconsciously looking for a way to process shared, unspoken loss.
Exactly. Especially resonant, she argues, in an era where Japanese society, and perhaps many societies, have experienced profound collective loss, economic problems, the breakdown of communities, rising solitude.
So reading Haruki becomes almost a communal, albeit solitary, act of processing.
Kind of. She suggests his novels offer readers this very self-reflective experience, a process of confront wounds, restore memory, attempt healing.
It makes you look inwards at your own private losses, but also outwards towards public memory, societal history.
Right. It prompts this active engagement, leading ultimately to that fundamental question she keeps circling back to. What is true healing? It's a much more interactive, almost therapeutic reading journey than just getting lost in a story.
And this view of his work seems to connect directly to how she describes Haruki himself as a kind of boundary dweller.
Yes, Jiang Yan'an. She sees him as someone who just freely moves across borders. He transcends the usual rules, the grammar of Japanese literature, crosses languages, genres, subjects. He refuses to be pinned down.
Which is interesting. Given his immense fame, you'd think he'd be boxed in by it.
But she observes he does the opposite. Despite being this huge cultural phenomenon in Japan and beyond, he deliberately avoids just passively engaging with the public hype.
He keeps his distance, maintains that solitude, like someone always remaining on the road, as she puts it.
Yeah, he's even said he prefers places like New York or Tokyo sometimes because he's less likely to be recognized. It gives him freedom.
And she connects this personal stance, this boundary status and distancing, back to the core themes.
Directly. She sees it as stemming from this powerful will to separate himself from the temptation of collective forgetting, or just conforming to whatever the current trend is.
So it's his existential stance. Being that solitary figure, actively resisting historical trauma, not just in his books, but in his life as an author.
Exactly. It's not just a personality quirk. It's fundamental artistic integrity. And this unique position he occupies, moving between the everyday and deep aesthetic experiments, reality and fantasy, empathy and alienation.
That becomes the engine driving his exploration of what she calls literary healing power.
Yes. He keeps moving, doesn't rest on his laurels, always pushing towards the next sentence, the next story, the next way of asking these difficult questions.
Which brings us back, maybe, to that haunting question from Norwegian Wood that echoes through so much of his work. Where are you now?
Yeah. And Kim Eun-kyo's book gives us such a profound answer to what Haruki himself is doing where he is now.
He's not just the icon of solitude, not just the dreamweaver.
No. He's an artist who is unflinchingly enduring the dark, often unspoken layers of Japan's modern history. The war, the guilt, the loss, the silence. And he's doing it through this painstaking, courageous process of memory restoration.
Using those melancholic, surreal landscapes to get closer to truths that society often wants to push away. Not avoiding the difficult parts, but tackling them in his own unique, powerful way.
Absolutely. And Kim Eun-kyo really emphasizes what's at the heart of Haruki's literature. It's the courage not to fear the solitude that comes with being that solitary figure.
It's that experimental literary spirit that actively pushes back against the tide of forgetting.
And a really strong sense of responsibility, wouldn't you say, to restore memory, both individual and collective.
Definitely. So in the end, his literature isn't just telling stories, it's posing that existential question to all of us. Where are you now?
Yeah. And at the same time, maybe showing us a new path towards healing. One that can somehow hold both our personal wounds and the often hidden history of our communities.
So thinking about all this, what does it mean for you listening right now, maybe in your own life? How can this deep dive into Haruki's way of exploring memory and truth and healing? How might that resonate with your own search for meaning in, let's face it, a pretty complex world?
That's the real takeaway, isn't it? And maybe one final thought to leave you with.
Go on.
If Kim Eun-kyo is right, if Haruki's fantastical simulacra worlds are his way of confronting uncomfortable historical truths that society wants to forget, well, what illusions or maybe convenient stories might we ourselves be living within today?
What stories do we tell ourselves that stop us from seeing deeper truths about our present or maybe even about our own pasts?
Exactly. Something to think about.